The year is 1867. Secretary of State William Seward sits in his Washington office, fresh from completing the most audacious real estate deal in American history, the purchase of Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Critics are calling it Seward's folly. The press has dubbed it Seward's icebox. But Seward knows better. He's just made the first down payment on his master plan, the complete American domination of North America. Seward pulls out a map and traces his finger along the border between the United States and British North America. Nature has marked out our territory, he declares to his aide. It extends to the Arctic Ocean on the north and embraces many islands. I will not be satisfied until I see the British flag removed from every square mile of the North American continent. Within weeks, Seward's agents are secretly meeting with Canadian politicians, British colonial administrators, and anyone else who might have a price. The conversation is always the same. How much would it cost to buy Canada? The answer, as Seward is about to discover, is far more complicated than the price of Alaska. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we uncover the most audacious schemes and forgotten plots that shaped our world. If you're watching this from anywhere around the globe, drop a comment below telling us what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to discover is the incredible true story of how America not once but twice came within striking distance of purchasing an entire nation, and why those deals ultimately fell apart in the most dramatic ways possible. This isn't just a story about money and diplomacy. It's a tale of espionage, political intrigue, cultural collision, and the fundamental question of whether human societies can be bought and sold like commodities. The men who tried to buy Canada believed they were fulfilling America's manifest destiny. The people who stopped them believed they were saving their very souls. The story begins in the blood-soaked aftermath of the American Civil War, when the United States emerged as a military and industrial powerhouse with an insatiable appetite for territorial expansion. By 1865, the Union Army was the largest, most experienced, and best-equipped military force in the world. Union generals had mastered the art of total warfare, industrial-scale logistics, and rapid deployment across vast distances. The railroad networks built during the war could move massive armies anywhere on the continent within weeks. American factories were producing weapons, ammunition, and military equipment at rates that dwarfed European production. But perhaps most importantly, America had developed something unprecedented in military history: a professional officer corps with recent experience commanding armies of over 100,000 men in sustained combat operations. Generals like Ulysses Grant, William Tecumseh Sherman, and Philip Sheridan had learned how to coordinate complex military operations across multiple theaters simultaneously. This military might was not lost on British observers, who watched nervously as American armies demobilized along the Canadian border. Lord Monck, the Governor-General of British North America, warned London that Britain could not possibly defend Canada against a determined American assault. The military position of these provinces, he wrote, in the event of war with the United States would be hopeless. But the Americans had no intention of conquering Canada through military force. They had discovered something far more effective: economic pressure combined with financial inducement. Why fight a war when you could simply make an offer that couldn't be refused? The man orchestrating this strategy was William Seward, arguably the most brilliant and ruthless diplomatic mind of the 19th century. Seward understood that the post-Civil War moment represented a unique opportunity for American expansion. Britain was exhausted from decades of global conflict and struggling with the costs of maintaining its worldwide empire. The British provinces in North America were expensive to defend and contributed relatively little to imperial revenues. More importantly, Seward recognized that many Canadian politicians were frustrated with British rule and might be receptive to American offers of autonomy, investment, and political opportunity. The provinces that would become Canada were still separate entities with different economic interests, political systems, and cultural identities. Unity among them was fragile, and their loyalty to Britain was more pragmatic than passionate. Seward's strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Make the financial benefits of American annexation so attractive that Canadian politicians would voluntarily choose to join the United States. Offer them statehood, congressional representation, massive infrastructure investments, and access to American markets. Present annexation not as surrender but as promotion, from colonial subjects to equal partners in the world's fastest-growing economy. The plan seemed foolproof, but Seward had underestimated the complexity of Canadian identity and the determination of British officials who understood that losing Canada would effectively end Britain's status as a global power. The first serious attempt began in the winter of 1867, just months after Seward completed the Alaska Purchase. His agents made contact with Joseph Howe, a prominent Nova Scotia politician who had opposed Canadian Confederation and was known to favor closer ties with the United States. The initial conversations were carefully coded, disguised as discussions about trade agreements and transportation links. But the real message was unmistakable. The United States was prepared to pay handsomely for Canadian provinces to voluntarily join the American Union. The terms being discussed were extraordinary by any historical standard. Nova Scotia would receive immediate statehood and 2 seats in the U.S. Senate. The federal government would assume all provincial debts and provide a massive infrastructure package, including railroad construction, port improvements, and industrial development. Nova Scotia politicians would be guaranteed significant positions in the expanded American government. Most remarkably, the province would receive a direct cash payment, essentially a signing bonus for joining the United States. Joseph Howe was intrigued but cautious. He understood that such a deal would represent the beginning of the end of British North America, and he wanted assurances that other provinces would follow. "I will not see Nova Scotia made a cat's paw in this business," he warned Seward's agents. "If we are to become American, let us do it as part of a general reorganization of the continent." These conversations might have remained secret forever, but in February 1868, a remarkable coincidence exposed the entire plot. A State Department courier carrying coded communications about the Canada Purchase was involved in a train accident outside Baltimore. The courier was killed, and his diplomatic pouch was recovered by a Baltimore journalist who recognized the significance of what he was reading. The Baltimore Sun published excerpts from the communications under the headline, "Seward's Secret War Against Canada." The revelations caused a political sensation in both Washington and British North America. American newspapers debated whether buying Canada was a brilliant stroke of peaceful expansion or a dangerous violation of international law. Canadian newspapers denounced the scheme as an attempt to purchase our souls like Judas Silver, but the most explosive reaction came from London, where Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli recognized that American success in buying even one Canadian province would trigger a cascade of defections that would end British control of North America entirely. Disraeli's response was swift and decisive. He dispatched 10,000 additional British troops to Canada and authorized emergency construction of defensive fortifications along the American border. More importantly, he sent his most skilled diplomat, Lord Carnarvon, to negotiate a new arrangement that would bind the Canadian provinces more tightly to Britain, while giving them enough autonomy to resist American blandishments. The result was the British North America Act of 1867, which created the Dominion of Canada as a self-governing federation within the British Empire. This masterful compromise gave Canadians control over their internal affairs while maintaining British authority over foreign policy and defense. It was specifically designed to counter American annexation efforts by providing an alternative that satisfied Canadian desires for self-government without requiring them to abandon their British identity. But Seward wasn't finished. If he couldn't buy individual provinces, perhaps he could buy the entire new dominion at once. The price would be enormous, but the strategic value of controlling the entire North American continent justified almost any expense. In the spring of 1868, Seward authorized his most audacious gambit yet: a direct offer to purchase Canada from Britain for the staggering sum of $1 billion, more than twice the entire annual budget of the United States government. The offer was carefully structured to appeal to both British financial interests and Canadian political aspirations. Britain would receive $600 million in immediate payment, plus assumption of all Canadian debts. Canada would receive $400 million for infrastructure development, debt retirement, and economic modernization. all Canadian politicians would be guaranteed equivalent positions in the expanded American government. The Canadian provinces would become American states with full congressional representation and constitutional protection. Most remarkably, the offer included provisions for maintaining Canadian cultural institutions, legal systems, and even British-style parliamentary procedures within the new American states. Seward understood that successful annexation required cultural sensitivity as well as financial generosity. The billion-dollar offer created a crisis within the British government that almost led to the fall of Disraeli's administration. Chancellor of the Exchequer George Ward Hunt argued that Britain simply could not afford to reject such an enormous sum. The imperial treasury was strained by military commitments around the world, and $1 billion would solve Britain's financial problems for decades. But Disraeli understood that accepting the American offer would effectively end Britain's status as a world power. Canada is not a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, he declared to Parliament. It is the cornerstone of our imperial system and the foundation of our global influence. The day we sell Canada to the Americans is the day we cease to be a great power. The debate within the British cabinet was fierce and deeply personal. Several ministers had significant investments in Canadian enterprises and stood to gain enormously from American purchase. Others believed that Canadian independence was inevitable and that selling to the Americans was preferable to losing the provinces through revolution or war. The decisive factor was the unexpected intervention of Queen Victoria herself, who summoned Disraeli to a private audience and made clear her absolute opposition to any consideration of selling Canada. "Mr. Disraeli," she reportedly said, "we are not in the business of auctioning our empire to foreign powers regardless of the price they offer." But the American pressure was relentless, and Seward had one more card to play: economic warfare disguised as trade policy. In 1866, the United States had terminated the Reciprocity Treaty with British North America, ending favorable trade arrangements that were crucial to the Canadian economy. Seward now offered to restore reciprocity, provide massive trade concessions, and open American markets to Canadian products, but only if individual provinces agreed to hold referendums on American annexation. This offer created enormous pressure within Canadian politics, particularly in provinces like Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, where the economy was heavily dependent on trade with the United States. Local business leaders began lobbying intensively for at least considering the American offers, and several provincial politicians publicly suggested that referendums on annexation might be appropriate. The crisis reached its peak in the summer of 1868, when Joseph Howe publicly announced his intention to introduce a motion in the Nova Scotia legislature calling for a referendum on joining the United States. Howe's announcement triggered what historians now call the Summer of Uncertainty, when the future of British North America hung in the balance. British officials reacted with barely controlled panic. Lord Monck was authorized to offer whatever concessions were necessary to prevent the referendum, including massive infrastructure investments, debt forgiveness, and enhanced provincial autonomy. The British Treasury, despite its earlier reluctance, was instructed to outbid the Americans for Canadian loyalty. But the most effective British response was cultural rather than financial. British agents launched a sophisticated propaganda campaign designed to convince Canadians that joining the United States would mean losing their distinctive identity and becoming absorbed into an alien cultural system. The campaign emphasized the differences between British parliamentary democracy and American presidential government, between British social traditions and American individualism, between British imperial identity and American republicanism. "Do you want to become Americans?" asked one widely distributed pamphlet. "Or do you want to remain what you are? British subjects with the dignity and traditions that identity provides?" This cultural argument proved remarkably effective, particularly among French Canadians who feared that American annexation would threaten their language, religion, and legal traditions. Catholic Church leaders, who had initially been neutral on the annexation question, began actively opposing American offers after concluding that Protestant America would not protect Catholic French-Canadian rights. The Summer of Uncertainty ended abruptly in September 1868, when Joseph Howe announced that he was withdrawing his referendum motion in exchange for British promises of immediate debt relief and railroad construction for Nova Scotia. Howe's reversal effectively ended the first American attempt to purchase Canada, but it did not end American ambitions for continental domination. The failure of Seward's purchase plan led to a fundamental reassessment of American strategy toward Canada. If direct purchase was impossible, perhaps gradual economic integration would achieve the same result over time. This approach would require patience and subtlety, but it might prove more effective than dramatic gestures that triggered British resistance. The new strategy was implemented by Seward's successors in the State Department, who began what historian Donald Creighton called the Silent Invasion, a systematic campaign to make Canada economically dependent on the United States, while maintaining the fiction of political independence. American investors were encouraged to acquire Canadian businesses, particularly in strategic industries like transportation, communications, and natural resources. American banks were authorized to establish Canadian branches that could offer more favorable terms than British financial institutions. American corporations were given preferential access to Canadian markets through carefully negotiated trade agreements that appeared reciprocal but actually favored American interests. This economic strategy proved remarkably successful over the following decades. By 1900, American investment in Canada exceeded British investment for the first time since Confederation. American corporations controlled significant portions of the Canadian railroad system, mining industry, and manufacturing sector. Canadian natural resources were increasingly processed in American factories rather than British mills. But the most significant development was the gradual reorientation of Canadian trade patterns away from Britain and toward the United States. This shift was partly the result of geography and transportation costs, but it was accelerated by American policies designed to make north-south trade more profitable than east-west trade. The long-term implications of this economic integration were not lost on Canadian political leaders, who began to worry that their country was becoming an American economic colony, regardless of its formal political independence. "We may still salute the Union Jack," warned one Canadian parliamentarian, "but we are paying our bills with American dollars." However, just when it seemed that gradual economic absorption might achieve what direct purchase had failed to accomplish, international events intervened to create another opportunity for direct American acquisition of Canada. By 1917, Britain was financially exhausted by World War I and desperately needed American assistance to avoid economic collapse. The British Treasury had spent almost its entire gold reserves, borrowed to the limits of its capacity, and was facing the possibility of national bankruptcy if the war continued much longer. This crisis created an opening for the second, even more audacious American attempt to purchase Canada. This time as part of a complex financial arrangement to rescue Britain from economic disaster. The man who conceived this scheme was not a government official, but a private financier with unprecedented access to political power, J.P. Morgan, whose banking empire had become the unofficial central bank of the Allied war effort. Morgan understood that Britain's financial crisis represented a historic opportunity to reshape the global balance of power. If properly managed, the war could end with the United States controlling both the world's financial system and the entire North American continent. The key was structuring British war debt in ways that would eventually force Britain to surrender its North American territories as collateral. Morgan's plan was brilliant in its complexity and breathtaking in its scope. The United States would provide Britain with a massive loan, eventually totaling over $10 billion, secured by British assets around the world. The loan terms would include provisions allowing the United States to assume control of specified British territories if repayment schedules were not met. Canada, as Britain's most valuable North American territory, would serve as the primary collateral for this loan. If Britain defaulted, the United States would automatically acquire sovereignty over the entire Canadian Federation. Even if Britain managed to repay the loan, the debt service payments would be so large that Britain would eventually be forced to sell non-essential territories to meet its obligations. The beauty of Morgan's scheme was that it avoided the political complications that had doomed Seward's direct purchase offers. Instead of asking Britain to sell Canada, the United States would simply be accepting Canada as security for loans that Britain desperately needed. Instead of negotiating with Canadian politicians, Americans would be dealing with British financial officials who had limited alternatives. Most importantly, the arrangement could be presented as American assistance for a wartime ally, rather than American imperialism toward a weaker neighbor. British officials could accept the deal without admitting they were selling their empire, and Canadian politicians could be excluded from negotiations that were ostensibly about international finance rather than territorial transfer. Morgan began implementing this plan in late 1917, working closely with Treasury Secretary William McAdoo and Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Warburg. The initial loan agreements included seemingly technical provisions about collateral requirements and default procedures that were actually designed to facilitate eventual American acquisition of Canadian territory. But Morgan had underestimated the sophistication of his British counterparts, particularly Chancellor of the Exchequer Bonar Law, who quickly recognized the implications of the American loan terms. Law's response was to create an alternative financing mechanism that would meet Britain's immediate needs without putting Canadian sovereignty at risk. Working with Canadian Finance Minister Thomas White, Law structured a complex arrangement where Canada would assume responsibility for a significant portion of British war debt in exchange for enhanced autonomy and guaranteed constitutional protection. This arrangement, formalized in the Imperial War Cabinet's Resolution on Dominion Status, effectively removed Canada from the collateral pool available to secure British-American loans. It also established the principle that Dominion territories could not be used as security for imperial debts without the explicit consent of Dominion governments. The resolution was a masterful piece of constitutional innovation that solved Britain's immediate financial problems while protecting Canadian sovereignty. But it also created the foundation for what would eventually become complete Canadian independence from both British and American control. Morgan's scheme collapsed in early 1918, when it became clear that Canada would not be available as loan collateral, and that Britain had developed alternative financing sources that reduced its dependence on American credit. The United States continued to play a crucial role in Allied financing, but the opportunity to acquire Canada through debt manipulation had been lost. The failure of both purchase attempts had profound long-term consequences for North American development and international relations. For the United States, the failure to acquire Canada meant that its American continental expansion had reached its natural limits. Future American growth would have to come through economic development rather than territorial acquisition, and American global influence would have to be exercised through financial and technological power rather than geographical control. For Canada, successfully resisting American purchase offers became a foundational element of national identity. The knowledge that Canada had twice been offered for sale but had refused to be sold created a distinctive Canadian sense of independence and self-determination that differentiated it from other former British colonies. For Britain, the Canadian purchase attempts demonstrated both the limits and the possibilities of imperial adaptation. While Britain had successfully prevented American acquisition of Canada, the crisis had forced fundamental changes in imperial relationships that pointed toward eventual decolonization. The most significant long-term consequence was the development of what historians call the third option, Canada's successful creation of a political and economic identity that was neither British nor American but distinctively Canadian. This third option required constant balancing between British institutional traditions and American economic opportunities, between imperial loyalty and national independence, between continental integration and transcontinental identity. The skills required for this balancing act became central to Canadian political culture and helped explain Canada's later success in international diplomacy and peacekeeping. But the story doesn't end with the failure of American purchase attempts. The economic integration that began as an alternative to political annexation eventually created relationships between Canada and the United States that were closer and more complex than anything that existed between most sovereign nations. By the late 20th century, the two countries had developed what economists call deep integration, economic relationships so extensive that national boundaries had become largely irrelevant for business purposes. Canadian and American economies became so intertwined that neither country could make major economic decisions without considering impacts on the other. This economic integration was formalized through the North American Free Trade Agreement, which created a continental economic zone that accomplished many of the goals that Seward and Morgan had hoped to achieve through political annexation. Goods, services, capital, and even workers could cross the Canadian-American border with minimal restrictions, creating a single North American economic space. The irony is that this economic integration was achieved through voluntary cooperation rather than imposed through purchase or conquest. Canada maintained its political sovereignty while voluntarily accepting economic arrangements that were far more extensive than anything the 19th century annexationists had envisioned. Today, the question of American purchase of Canada seems quaint and anachronistic. Modern nations don't buy and sell territories the way 19th century powers traded colonial possessions. The very idea that human societies could be purchased like commodities has become morally and politically unacceptable. But the underlying dynamics that drove the purchase attempts, economic integration, security cooperation, and cultural exchange, continue to shape North American development in ways that fulfill many of the continental vision that motivated Seward and Morgan. The United States and Canada have achieved something unprecedented in international relations. Two sovereign nations that are so closely integrated economically, militarily, and culturally that they function almost like a single continental system while maintaining distinct national identities and political institutions. This arrangement provides benefits that pure political annexation could never have achieved. Both countries retain the flexibility to pursue independent foreign policies when their interests diverge, while cooperating closely when their interests align. Both maintain distinctive cultural institutions while sharing a continental economic space. Both preserve democratic accountability within their own systems, while coordinating policies that affect their shared continental environment. The failure to buy Canada turned out to be one of the most fortunate failures in American history. It forced both countries to develop more sophisticated and sustainable forms of relationship than the crude domination that purchase would have represented. Professor Archive will continue exploring the hidden schemes and forgotten plots that shaped our world. But this particular story demonstrates how the most audacious plans often fail for reasons their creators never anticipated, and how those failures sometimes produce better outcomes than success would have achieved. Before you go, remember to subscribe to Professor Archive if this exploration of America's attempts to purchase an entire nation opened your eyes to the complex forces that shape international relations. Drop a comment below, letting us know what time it is, where you are, and which city you're viewing from, and share your thoughts. Do you think Canada would be different today if those purchase attempts had succeeded? What does this story reveal about the relationship between economic power and political sovereignty? How do modern forms of economic integration compare to the territorial annexation that 19th century powers pursued? The story of how America tried to buy Canada reveals much about the ambitions and limitations of great powers. But it also demonstrates the unpredictable ways that national identities develop and international relationships evolve. Sometimes the deals that don't get made turn out to be more important than the ones that do.